And welcome back. Another episode of a Modern Nonprofit podcast. I'm Tosha Anderson, the host here, and today I brought along my friend Bill. Bill Cummings is the founder and CEO, I guess, or we all have different
Mm,
titles, but
Sure.
of a company that helps with coaching, messaging, and design. Think about brand building, all of your marketing, the appearance, the impressions of your nonprofit. Bill works in so many of the different areas. We'll talk a little bit more about that, but he works specifically with nonprofits. Bill, thank you so much for joining us. And I'm really excited to get going on this. I'm an accountant by day. My credentials say by day, but as we've met a couple times now, marketing is a huge passion of mine. And I really, when we started talking about some other type of work, and I invited you to come on this podcast, I was really excited to start talking about this because I think the nonprofit space is not able to, or has not historically invested enough into their kind of brand, if you will. So thanks for joining us. And
Yeah.
I'm excited to start talking about some of these things.
Yeah, I'm excited to be here. Thanks for having me on.
So speaking of, we both own for-profit businesses, and you work sometimes with for-profit businesses. And of course, we're trying to market and brand our own business. So I always like to think about, what do I do as a for-profit versus what I advise my clients, our clients, right, on the nonprofit side. So if you were to describe your experience and the difference between these two sectors, what do you think is similar with these two, for-profit and nonprofit? And then what is unique about these two different types of businesses?
Yeah, I think in general, the over time, the difference has narrowed. I think years
Mm-hmm.
ago, we saw businesses and nonprofits as very different entities in our communities. But I think the difference is narrowed. And really, from my perspective, the main difference that remains is that legally, nonprofits can't
Mm-hmm.
distribute funds, to private entities, or profits to those, to those entities. Other than that, I think there's more things
Mm-hmm.
that are similar than that are different, for
I love
sure.
that. I love that because I say that all the time, right? And I think that especially now, nonprofits are trying to operate more in the entrepreneurial sense, because they have to. Like, we
Yeah.
hear about diversifying funding. They want more control over the funding and the work that they do and how they do it. So I
Yeah.
completely agree with that. So along those same lines, so you've led and supported so many different organizations, been introduced to so many different organizations. What are the two or three things that consistently stand out from your perspective that an organization might be able to improve or grow upon?
Yeah. Well, I think back to your first question is, seeing yourself as an entity that functions like a business. Like
Hmm.
I've heard a lot, there's a little bit of a, focus lately on the idea that the word nonprofit really is a misnomer, that we should
Hmm.
be focused on for impact rather than being a nonprofit. So
Hmm.
I think getting out of the mindset that we're in this to not make a profit, like we shouldn't be known for
Hmm.
what we're not doing. We should be known for what we are doing. So I think that's really
Love
important.
that.
And then I also think one thing that's kind of bothered me, maybe this is because I was a CEO of a nonprofit organization, so I'm tuned into this, but as I work with multiple nonprofits all over the country and organizations that are working all over the world, it really kind of pains me to see that compensation is there's a big gap from what somebody who's a leader and a really strong leader in the nonprofit space is making
Hmm.
compared to what they could make in the for-profit space. So a lot of really
Yeah.
good and talented leaders are being recruited away from nonprofits to the for-profit world, where they're just like, hey, in today's world and our economy and families and support, like I've got to make the shift. So my
Yeah.
hope would be that we just pay people more. Another thing is, I think, often boards of directors, which are great people who are investing volunteer hours, countless hours to
Hmm.
invest in these organizations, but oftentimes get caught in the weeds and end up micromanaging organizations. Like, for
Hmm.
instance, I just talked to a CEO who's in a new role in New York City, and she let me
Hmm.
know that she has to get permission from the board to spend any more than $250. And this is a
Hmm.
very well-funded organization. And it just
Hmm.
handcuffs her from being able to move things forward on a day-to-day basis, where she's waiting for approval from a board, to do that. And then I also think, and this is specific to our work, but I think nonprofits really could improve how they portray themselves, how they're seen in the
Hmm.
world, through their leadership, through their branding, through their messaging, to just elevate their game as far as how they're perceived by the people that they're trying to reach and connect with in their communities.
I love all of those things that you just mentioned. I also used to work for a nonprofit, I think, as you know, not as CEO, but I was essentially like a chief financial officer. And,
Yeah.
I've seen all of those things that you just mentioned, and I think they're all huge problems. And I mean, certainly the low compensation is something, we've all that have worked in this space have kind of battled. And then also boards that don't really understand their function.
Yeah.
We've all seen instances of that. I still see instances of that kind of in this role that I'm in now. But I think the branding, and it's really interesting. I was kind of thinking about this. Branding, I think, is so important for anything, the success of anything. And I say thing, meaning
Yeah.
business, for profit, nonprofit, and people, right? So I actively recruit and interview employees. And it's very interesting to me that I was kind of thinking the other day that there should be a whole self branding course in college now, because the days of just, going in for an interview initially and you just send in your resume and then you send a thank you letter through the mail, like so much of it's virtual, and so many people now have an online presence even right out of college, like with LinkedIn
Yeah.
or the appearance of their resume, and just how do you make yourself stand out. I think branding is just one of those things that all of the things could benefit from that. So
Yeah.
I
No,
agree.
I think if I could interject there and just say, like,
Yeah.
yes, like we are a brand. Like how we
Hmm.
present ourselves to the world is a brand. And thankfully there's a lot of information that in the last 5 years, especially, it's been out there that's talking a lot about authenticity and how we present ourselves to the
Hmm.
world, that it doesn't have to be this polished corporate, kind of vibe, that we can be ourselves. We
Yeah.
can show up in the
Yeah.
world as ourselves. I mean, while, making sure we're, cleaned up and presenting ourselves to the
Hmm.
world in a way that's like, presentable, but yet we can be ourselves,
Hmm.
and people are part of brand. So to back to the last
Yeah.
question, I think another thing that organizations can do to grow is the people that they're presenting to their communities are part of their brand. So I
Hmm.
think a lot of organizations that are working, especially in marginalized communities, if the people that are presented as leaders of that organization from a leadership structure or the board don't represent the people that are being served in that community, that's off brand in my mind. That's not,
Yes,
and that
I
sounds
agree.
superficial, but there should be much more depth to the reasons for changing those. We don't want diversity for the sake of diversity. We want that to be the heart of an organization, but that's
Yeah,
a part of your identity and who you are and how you present yourself to your community.
completely agreed. So we kind of hinted on a little bit in the last question, but kind of something else that's an ongoing problem, just the complete lack of capacity for nonprofit leaders, right? They're busy, they're overwhelmed, they're burnout, running organizations with so many different resources that are so limited, funding, staffing, space, all of these things. What with that in mind, what are ways that leaders can rise above that to be more effective and impactful? Now, we talk about that a lot in our firm about the accounting side, but I think we could use that theme amongst many of the different areas within the business of the nonprofit. What are some of the areas that you've seen could be maybe done more efficiently and therefore be more impactful?
Sure. Well, I mean, you mentioned it as part of your question, is just the how overwhelmed nonprofit leaders are. They're scrambling around, making sure the programs are running smoothly. They're running around to the
Hmm.
next, donor meeting and
Hmm.
planning for the, next annual report, and just keeping their heads above water in many cases. But I think investing in yourself as a leader is
Hmm.
is primary, in investing in staff development. So there's constantly that challenge out there to grow as leaders and grow as teams,
Hmm.
which I then
Hmm.
that think it leads to another point that I think of, and that is shared leadership. I think is really vital in the world we live in today. I think the
Hmm.
days of the top-down leadership structure are over, and those who are
Hmm.
hanging on to it might lose really good people, because you have really solid people in your organization. They're just longing for a seat at the table because they have something to offer more than maybe they're being tapped into for. So I think just more flattened leadership structures where there's still leaders or a leader who bears the weight of responsibility. There'll always be one person who cares about the work more deeply than everybody else in the team, and that's okay. Not everybody's going to take
Hmm.
it home with them like the leader does or a founder might. But I think calling people around a table, a diverse group of people who can speak to the leadership, of the organization from multiple perspectives, is vital, especially in the world that we're, growing into these days. And then I also think clarity from that leadership. So clear vision, clear mission, trying to eliminate mission drift, and then messaging and design that goes with that. And that's, again, specific to our work, but that's what I'm thinking about every day. So that's what's at the top of my mind. It's just making sure that the messaging of your organization is super clear, and that your design is kind of right up there with any other entity, for-profit entity in your community that's connecting with people and that, gets people's attention.
I love that. You mentioned something about shared leadership, and I want to give my thoughts on that too.
Yeah.
We talk a lot, especially on my side, we talk about accountability, we talk about transparency, and those words are generally true with like programmatic outcomes, I think, in financial numbers, right? And I hear a lot of that when I'm on calls with prospective clients of ours, and they say, I have greater accountability, I need greater we need greater accountability, the board wants it, or whatever, fill in the blank, right? And my observation oftentimes is an organization could be quite large, let's say, 75, 80 people. And the accountability of all of the things really rests on just 1 to 3 people, maybe.
Yeah.
And where it's been really interesting for me as an entrepreneur now that left the nonprofit space and now started my own firm, I have different service areas, I have different departments, I have different people that all report to me. Like there's really not many things that I own the full responsibility of. And I noticed as a CFO, it was like, the CEO, ultimately the CFO for the numbers, the fundraising person, right, that's responsible for meeting the fundraising quota, or I use the word quota because we're in the for-profit sales world, but the goal. And then sometimes, but not always, the programmatic people that are responsible for the outcomes of the program. And I think one of the things that I've noticed that the leaders of nonprofits hold all of that responsibility. And I see this oftentimes to the degree that not even financial statements by department are shared by the CEO. We're not holding different department leaders responsible for their little divisions of the business. And I've said this so many times that I feel like really only in the nonprofit world is that really the case, because I think another big difference between the nonprofit and the for-profit world, if you are a division leader of anything in business, you have a couple key responsibilities for the success of your role. And that's going to be meeting your financial numbers. So whether you're in sales, you're in marketing, you're in distribution, you're in, of course, like warehousing, you're whatever it could be. I'm just thinking anything. Like everyone knows their numbers specific to their particular department, even though they're not the accountant, right? And second to that, they have a duty and responsibility to develop their team into A players. So how can you effectively delegate, and how can you hold your team responsible for the subset of responsibilities that you've been delegated, right? And I think in the nonprofit world, we don't do that. So much so, I have a case study that an organization I was working with had pages and pages and pages of programmatic outcomes by funder, right? And they basically showed this list. It was 5 pages front and back on an Excel spreadsheet printed out. That's how many outcomes they were subject to. The frontline workers, meaning the social workers that are going into these homes and doing counseling for families and individuals, they had no idea who was funding them, no idea what the outcomes were, no idea how much the organization had committed to services delivered, how many hours of therapy that they needed, or how many groups of therapy, or what the success criteria, 90% of our participants are going to achieve these results. They had no idea, right? And so going back to kind of nonprofits, leaders being overwhelmed or burnout, I, as running a for-profit business, my entire team, from my chief operating officer and business partner all the way down to our intern, knows how much we're going to achieve financially. Like, where are we at with respect to those? How many clients are in the pipeline? How many new clients did we bring on board? Like, what clients are we falling behind on, or what deadlines did we not meet? All of the things everybody knows. And I think that for me as a leader to share that weight helped me tremendously fight the overwhelming feeling and burnout. So I don't know if you had the same experience or not, but
yeah, absolutely. I mean, you hit on so many good, important points, I think, that nonprofit leaders need to be thinking about. And I think of a specific example in the fundraising, on the fundraising side of nonprofits. One thing I've always communicated is everybody's fundraising all the time. There's not just a development team that's focused on fundraising. Everything all of us do speak to our capacity to fundraise, because if programs aren't running well, then we can't provide good, solid impact numbers, to our constituents, so that the people who are doing the branding and messaging, design and marketing have something to show, that's credible, that really shows a reason why people should continue to invest in our work. So I think, so many organizations, both for-profit and nonprofit, have too often operated in silos where you got different departments, arguing for budget money. Like the program people are saying, we need more program money. The fundraising people, we need more fundraising dollars to get out there to raise more money. And by doing it the way that you just described in your organization, it makes everybody feel like, hey, we're all on the same team. We're not competing against each other for dollars. We're supporting each other with the investment of those dollars, So I think that's vital.
Yeah. It's so interesting, so many different areas, but I think it kind of speaks to like messaging and branding, like we're talking about. But another example of how businesses do this, and I started incorporating. So we've always talked in the nonprofit world that everybody's responsible for fundraising, right? And more organizations are starting to feel like more and more people need to be involved in the financial management and the responsibility of the organization. Another area that I've noticed in nonprofits that are it's a bit of a struggle is staffing, retention, hiring, building culture. And I just read a book, Who by Jeff Smart, and it talks a lot about interviewing and recruiting and how to build an A-player team. And one of the things that I really took away from that I love so much about the book, so much that I'm now requiring every single person on my team, because everyone on my team could be subject to interviewing a potential candidate at any given time. So it makes sense that they all have to read it now.
Sure.
It's a fairly short read, but it really speaks to it's the entire team's responsibility. Everyone on the team is responsible for recruiting. So identifying top talent, understanding how we recruit and screen for top talent, and building a culture of we only accept A players to build our team. So I think that's another area that, again, in silo, it's the HR person or it's the accountant that just so happened to inherit the HR responsibilities. It's their job to find all of this talent. And so how do we, leaders have a responsibility to develop that talent and search for it and recruit it. So you probably know, as a growing business owner, the struggle for that. And I will confess, there's some of these things that I still, up until recently, shouldered the weight of hiring, training, developing team members, and maintaining a culture that was primarily on my shoulders. And a few months ago, I just, we're not doing this anymore. Not doing this anymore. It's not sustainable. So speaking of balance and leadership, one other thing I want to talk about, tell us a little bit more about balancing the leadership, messaging, and design that we've kind of been talking about, weaving in through. But so I want to go back to that.
Yeah.
So the balance of leadership, messaging, and design. What are some of the things that you do that's central to your work to help nonprofits achieve these?
Yeah, I think on the leadership side, it's so important that leaders set the vision for an organization and that they give themselves space and time to be thinking about vision. In that idea we talked about earlier of being like caught in the weeds. And I talked to one executive director, like, hey, somebody didn't show up and I needed to go, and he described what he had to do. And it was very much a program function. And I'm all for the willingness of a CEO to clean the toilets. I work for an organization where we, to save some dollars, we all chipped in every Monday, the whole office clean. We were given different responsibilities. We all went around, did that. Cool. But on a day-to-day basis, the leaders who should be setting the tone and the vision for the organization shouldn't be doing those functions. There's other people who can do them well. So setting vision, giving yourself space and time to be out ahead of everyone else on your team. Not that you're more important than them or that it's a top-down kind of thing, but you're the person who's seeing where the organization needs to go and helping guide them there. So, I heard I'm a follower of Simon Sinek's work, and he's often said that like a CEO really shouldn't be a CEO. He should be a CVO, a chief visionary officer for the organization, because a chief program officer is doing programs. A chief financial officer is doing finance. What's the chief executive officer doing? Executing.
Vision.
Shouldn't be executing. You should be
Mm-hmm.
visioning. You should be thinking out ahead of
Mm-hmm.
everybody. So helping organizations and leaders think in terms of setting the vision, setting the tone. So that's how, like, that might be related to strategic planning, which we do with organizations. We walk alongside of them to think
Mm-hmm.
of what's the plan for executing on your vision for the next 3 years, so that you can just, follow that plan and be the visionary that's out ahead of that. And then on the messaging side, I just think it's so important that organizations focus on the words they use,
Mm-hmm.
to describe who they are, what they do. So we work with organizations to determine their why statement. Like, why do you do what you do? Because as Simon
Mm-hmm.
Sinek talks about, people are much more interested in why you do what you do than what you do or how you do it. So we start there,
Mm-hmm.
and then we fill in the blanks with a pretty rigorous process of making sure your vision align, your mission and your vision align, that your programs are aligned to those, and the words that you use to describe those things, that your positioning and your personalities in place. You have boilerplate copy, for your About Us page, and for copying and pasting that into grant, proposals and all of that. So the words you use, both verbally, so that speaks all the way down to an elevator pitch. Like, what's everybody saying when they have that 30-second opportunity to share about their work? Let's get aligned on that, so we're all saying the same thing. So I think messaging is so important, so vital. We live in a world where people are getting so many words, thrown their way, and, tweets and posts and social media, that we have to be extremely clear about who we are and what we do. And then on the design side, I just think there's an opportunity for nonprofits to really elevate, their presentation to a community. I always say, why does the latest, greatest, tech startup that's just well-funded have to have such better design than a nonprofit, who often their website and the design of all of that, their marketing and their materials and their collateral looks like it was done 15 years ago and never updated. If you look at some of the best companies in the world, you could Google it right after this episode, history of Apple's logo, history of Starbucks logo, and they're tweaking it and changing it over time. As times are changing and design styles are changing, they're moving ahead and staying ahead of the curve on those. So I think there's a real opportunity for nonprofits to just be credible and to just fight through the noise, and have people go to their website or get an annual report and be wowed by, like, man, this is amazing. It makes me want to look at it, rather than kind of turn my eyes away from it because it just looks like it was done in 1985,
I love when you say the why, because I probably, like you, look at a lot of nonprofit websites when nonprofits reach out and are inquiring about the services we offer. And I ask this about my own business too, so I'm not picking on nonprofits. Bill, you and I talked about that, about my website. But I think that if you go to a website and you, after spending more than, I don't know, you're the expert, not me, but if you spend more than like 30 seconds or less, probably 15 seconds, and you can't figure out what this business does, whether it's for profit or nonprofit, to me, that's a problem. And I will say that even with my own website, there's so much noise on websites oftentimes that what you do or why you do what you do is completely lost in the noise. And I can't tell you how many times I've gone to nonprofit websites and I'm like searching, because I'm going to get on a call and talk about their programming. I'm searching for, how do I figure out what they do? And sometimes I'll look at their tax return, which is a little bit more summarized or sometimes more detailed depending on the nonprofit. And I have to go there to figure out, okay, what is their programming? What specifically are they getting achievements on? Because that's listed in their tax return. And that oftentimes does not align with what's in their with what's on their website, which tells me either their accounting has not been updated, which is very, very, very possible, or their website, which then kind of speaks to, are either one of these really reflective of where the organization is trying to go and the impact that they're trying to move. So I've definitely seen that firsthand.
Yeah.
So we know we have these problems as nonprofit leaders. What are some of the things that they can implement, even as early as the next few weeks, that could immediately add value to the work they're doing?
Yeah, I think setting aside time to really have an honest evaluation of your leadership, where you're investing your time. I use a time tracker to just really track myself and where I'm investing my time in my organization. And I think it's important to just have an honest evaluation of where your time is being spent and where the time of your top leaders in your organization are investing their time. So, just really stepping back and saying, are there enough people providing leadership with an eye on vision and not necessarily tactics in the day-to-day. Like everybody has tactics, and we all have tasks or things to do, regardless of what level of leadership you're in. But that should be less for those who are at the highest levels of leadership, because their focus shouldn't be on checking, off things on their to-do list. It should be more on, where's the organization headed? How can I make sure that we're prepared to go there? So that'd be one. And then kind of, to speak to what you do, I think financial management, like looking at your finances and making sure that you're doing a good job, tracking your finances, where they're going, making sure you have the right chart of accounts set up. So in the right way that you're looking at your finances as it relates specific to your organization. So you have a real sense of how you're investing your money, because that speaks to, because I thought of time and I thought of money as the two things that you can easily assess. Like, where am I spending my time? How are we investing our money, and making sure that it's being invested well in the areas that are going to make us most effective as an organization, that are going to help us grow or achieve our goals over the next year, 3 years, 5 years. And then I also think of, and this, may sound like sales pitchy for the work that you and I do, but I think hire outside help. I think, I recently saw, and I don't remember where I saw this, but it was in the last week. I saw a cartoon drawn of a person inside of a jar, a glass jar. And the article was communicating, when you're in that glass jar, when you're leading an organization, it's like you're in a glass jar and you can't see your own label. You can look out through the glass jar and see other people's labels, but you can't see your own label. It's because you're in it so much, because we're leaders of nonprofit organizations are in the work so much. They only know what they know because they're in it, and they should be in it. So important to have somebody who isn't in the jar with you, to help you see your work from an outside perspective and say, hey, here are some things that I think you can do to strengthen your work, from a perspective that, because the people you're trying to connect with, both the people you're trying to connect as far as potential donors or potential beneficiaries of your services and programs, they're the ones who need to see clearly who you are and what you do. So you need somebody who's also outside the jar to be able to read the label and maybe make some adjustments to that label, so it is clear to everyone else who's also outside the jar. So hiring outside help is always vital and always been beneficial to me as I've led nonprofit organizations. And I would never go back and change that, because it helped me tremendously. It helped me grow. It helped our organization grow.
I love so many. I jotted down a couple of notes while you were talking, because a few lessons I learned. Every single thing that you mentioned, I have lessons learned, hard lessons learned in that sense. Going back to time tracking, that sounds like a very daunting, tedious task. But I read something one time that if you are a leader and you're spending more than 30% of your time on, just say, some sort of function, right? Then it's time for you to carve that out into another position, to kind of delegate that off of your plate, so that you can then do more. So 30% of your time. So track your time, figure out what 30% is or more of any key function, and then start figuring out, that's like a new hire I need to have. That's something new I need to do. So that's something that I really taken to heart. And I've started implementing some of that for myself, right? So there are certain things that I definitely find myself doing 30% that someone else could do. I could train. So I've been very intentional about creating different positions, because I do believe that when people have very direct, clear roles within organizations, for profit, nonprofit, doesn't matter, that people will thrive. It's predictable, it's clear, they know where they're going. When you have, so when my firm was smaller, I would have 5 people running around like chickens with their heads cut off, trying to do 1,000,001 things on any given day. And everyone was just stressed and right? My goal is to continue to carve out 30%. We have a new job. 30, and not just for me, but my chief operating officer, my manager. So we're constantly looking, where are there opportunities to create new positions that will be very clear. So I love that about time tracking. It sounds very daunting, but there's an end goal in mind to start assessing, to your point, like what does that mean? Like that. One thing that I started doing too, when you talk about creating space to be a visionary, if you're going to show up every day and run a marathon between, I want to say 8 to 5, but let's be honest, it's probably more like 7 to 6 or 7 to 7. You're not going to be able to be creative. And Bill, you're a creative mind. You know this. Creative is more sporadic bursts of energy. It comes to you. But if you're bombarded with the noise, in the distractions of putting out the fire. I remember Bill dealing with like overflowing plumbing when I worked for the nonprofit. Like, I'm not going to be visionary and creative when I'm dealing with plumbing crisis, right? One of the things that I do a couple times a year, I take like a creative sabbatical. It doesn't mean I'm sitting on the beaches of Bali, drinking fresh squeezed juice and journaling. It was something as simple as I took a week off, and I worked from home away from the noise, and I didn't take any meetings, and I really worked on building out a new division in a new project. So giving yourself permission and time to just think and be and create that vision. I don't know a single nonprofit leader that frankly does that, especially on a regular basis. I would have never known to do that. But I've noticed that when I eliminate myself or remove myself from the distraction, the day-to-day marathons that I'm running, that's where all of these new fresh ideas come from.
Yeah.
And you talked about hiring help. One of the things that I've learned, when I started, I'm a CPA, I'm an accountant, right? And I can do the accounting, no problem. I'm pretty good at that. But for my own survival and insanity, I had to surrender to the idea of hiring other people to help me, Bill, because people aren't going to know about me and hire me if they don't see that I exist, right? And for me, I thought I was going to end up having a PhD in digital marketing, all of the self-taught that I was trying to do with digital marketing and web development. I'm learning code and all this craziness. I spent so many hours just exhausted, burnout, resenting the business, frankly, because I was trying to teach myself how to do these things. And the reality is I had to just hire people smarter than me. And I think what so many leaders do, I've been guilty of this myself, that I have to hire somebody and train. The problem is there is not a human out there that knows all of the things that all of the businesses need, right? I mean, they just don't. They're not going to know their accounting. They're not going to know web development. They're not going to know marketing. They're not going to know fundraising and programming and all that. You can't know all the things. And so I try to hire people that can teach me some things. So hiring people smarter than me, not just help. So the part-time person that doesn't have all the skills, they have a few of them, but you think you can train them over time, you're just now adding more work to yourself. So hire people who are going to teach you some things, right?
Yeah.
Bill, and you probably do that yourself. And I know I've had to do that. I'm like, I just want to hire consultants to teach me a few things so I know what to look for next time. And I've learned that hard way, the expensive way, because I've hired a couple different consultants, and there's definitely a spectrum of talent, like any profession. But so I echo all of those things. And I think you and I have hopefully had that hard lesson learned. And for-profits and nonprofits are not that unique, Bill. When you started Groundswell, you had to learn how to build the business, run the business. It was just you. I was the same way. And I think it's very similar to those trying to start nonprofits and get those things up and running with very limited resources. I started in the same way. You started, I'm sure, the same way. So all these are certainly lessons that I think can be applied towards so many different types of business. So thank you for that.
Sure. Yeah. No, and thinking of what you just said, I think, we've got to do work on ourselves as well. Like we've got to set aside that time to do our own work on ourselves, to grow in our own level of security in who we are and what we bring to our organizations, to be comfortable enough to hire people smarter than us. Because there was definitely a time in my career where I wouldn't have done that, because I'd be threatened by having somebody that close that others might perceive as, wait, maybe that person should be the leader. They seem smarter than Bill, but that the more secure we are in ourselves, the more likely we're going to be like, hey, no, we absolutely, if we want to be more impactful and serve our clients, at a higher level, that's the kind of stuff we have to do. And there's going to be people that are smarter than us always, and we should bring them around us to make our work stronger.
Yes, exactly. I've had to surrender to the ego, so many times, and just say, I'm ultimately responsible for the results. So the path for which I get there, if that means hiring smarter, better, faster people, and most people have it in their minds, right, that there can't be someone that will do this better than them. And not because they're so arrogant, but they just obviously have been successful in their careers or in their lives because of the gifts and talents that they have. And I'm in a place now where my mission is, for every task I used to do, every function, let's say function, because tasks are numerous, but functions, right? I want to find someone better in accounting than I am to run, that part of the business, somebody better in marketing and visionary in that sense, better than I am, business development that can develop a rapport with our prospective clients, like even better than I am. So that's my goal now.
Yeah,
What
that's
I will
great.
do when I do all these things successfully, I have no idea. People ask me that all the time because I'm so
Right.
passionate and I talk often about this. But
Yeah.
I think it's the best for the business, right? So speaking of hiring people better than you, Bill, you do so much amazing work for nonprofits, and I've seen some of your work, and it's fantastic. Really re-envisioning or re-engineering the whole messaging and branding and image and first impressions, oftentimes, which is digital now, online, right, through websites, social, and that sort of thing. You've done so much of that work with nonprofits and has had tremendous success. So tell us a little bit more about that work. How did you end up working for nonprofits in this capacity?
Yeah. Well, I've been in the nonprofit world for, I'm dating myself by saying 30 years, going on 30 years.
Mm-hmm.
That's been my whole adult life and, majority of my vocational, pathway. Um, my wife and I and a couple close friends started a nonprofit organization in 2008 that served local leaders in Guatemala City who were doing gang prevention and education in an urban settlement community in Guatemala City. And we started
Mm-hmm.
out without really knowing what we were doing, in a lot of areas. We'd all been in the nonprofit world, but to start one from scratch was brand new to us. And inherently, we just knew how we present ourselves to the world. Like the work that was being done on the ground in Guatemala was amazing. Anybody who would go see that firsthand would be able to, like, oh my gosh, this is amazing. Some people need to know about this. So we thought, yeah, people need to know about this, but they need to notice it. It needs to stand out to them. It needs to stand out among the rest or the other options that they have. So right away, we just got, we started as a brand new organization with $0 in revenue. Thankfully, we had people in our network who could do this, is, designing a really good looking logo and selecting colors that stood out and putting a website together that told the story of the work that we were trying to support in a way that was simple, clear, and compelling. So we did that, and every 2 years or so, we would just make sure that our brand was staying on track, that it was still clearly communicating the work that we did, and that it was standing out. So if that meant tweaking the logo or changing the colors or realizing like, hey, that look is outdated now. Let's refine our look. Like websites are starting to have a lot more white space. Let's make sure there's like, we're not cluttering all of our pages with tons and tons of content and images. Let's give people space to breathe, so that just kind of got in us. So leading a nonprofit organization on the leadership side, so then we provide coaching, as part of what we do, but then the messaging and design side, we realize that those two things go hand in hand. The words you use and the look and feel of your website or your annual reports or anything that you produce that gets in the hands of people or is seen by their eyes is the representation, especially websites today or social media. Like that's the representation. That's people's entree into your work. That's their introduction into your work. And that first impression is vital, So then I started working, organically, had opportunities to coach other executive directors and some of the things that I had worked through. I learned a lot by making a lot of mistakes and learning from those lessons and having outside help come in and help me. I suddenly became that outside help for some of those organizations and realized like, that's what I love doing. I love that more than I love the job, of like, this is the organization, this is my role.
Yeah.
I wanted to provide that kind of support that I had and that I realized was important to other organizations. So I saw it's like, I perceive nonprofits, and for those who are listening won't be able to see this, but I perceive nonprofit leaders and nonprofit organizations as being some of the most important people and entities in our communities and in our world. So they're like up here. The messaging and design is often here. It's much lower. It falls short of that those amazing qualities that those people and those organizations have in our communities. And I see such an opportunity for organizations to elevate their message and elevate their design. So that's where Groundswell was born. It's this idea of wanting to get into the soil, and help a groundswell of support, be realized by organizations by getting our hands dirty and getting in kind of under the hood, so to speak, and helping kind of refine an organization's messaging and design. So it's our work is born out of a passion that I have for elevating nonprofits and having them seen as credible, respectable entities and organizations or in communities. Just like I said, some of the latest cool, trendy tech startups that are emerging in our cities.
I love that. So if somebody wanted to get in touch with you to talk more about the work that you're doing, maybe to advise them, coach them on their own nonprofit or nonprofit they know, what's the best way to get in touch with you?
Yeah, so you can find me on LinkedIn, Bill Cummings. And you'll see me connected to Groundswell, and then our website is meetgroundswell.com. So MEET groundswell.com. We help organizations with social media. We don't spend a lot of time on it ourselves. So social media is not going to be the place to find us. But so our website, LinkedIn, and my email address is bill@meetgroundswell.com. And I'd love to set up a time to talk to people about, what's important to them and the work that they're doing, serving the people that they serve.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Bill. It was great having you on and great discussion, I think, overall.
All right. Thank you, Tosha. Thanks for the work you do.
Thank you.